Hello, this is NE1 FM broadcasting to Newcastle and Gateshead. My name is Michael Quill and this is my programme Voices from the North East. It's a programme where I interview people from the North East, creative people by and large, and ask them about their lives and ask them about the important bits of music, prose, poetry, whatever, that have accompanied them along their lives. My first guest is Nigel Mellor. Welcome to the programme, Nigel.
Hi.
And we heard your first choice there, which was Blade and Races. Do you want to tell us why you chose Blade and Races?
Well, we have a family legend. Comes down from my gran. She always said that her grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, always claimed he'd written the Blade and Races. The first piece of evidence is when he died, the family were too poor to give him a proper burial, and some local journalists wrote a pamphlet about his life, and it mentions in this pamphlet about his work and his life and so on and so on. He worked in Armstrong's factory. He was a chain maker. That's not little tiny necklace chains, it's the giant chains.
This is the Armstrong Works on
the Armstrong Road. Yeah. The giant chains that they make the bridges with. And he worked there till he was in his 90s. And he was known throughout the factory as the poet of Elsick. Right. Anyway, this chap wrote a pamphlet about him and mentions quite a number of his poems and things that he wrote, and one of them is Gannon to Blade and Races. Okay, so we have it there in writing, but it's not enough evidence really. But the final part is the song was popularised by Geordie Ridley,
yes,
who was a really good entertainer at the time. He'd been a miner and he'd been injured, and made his living as an entertainer. He died very young. It's a very sad story, but anyway. He a very successful entertainer in the North East, travelled all over, and we think the connection is that my great-great-grandfather, they used to take lodgers in occasionally, mm-hmm. and Geordie Ridley stayed with them from time to time, and what we think is possibly that's how the words got taken up by Geordie Ridley, if there's any truth in it. I mean, Geordie Ridley's a fantastic entertainer. I'm not knocking the guy as a creative performer, but we have this legend that it came from my great-great-grandfather.
Well, I think for the purposes of this programme, Nigel, there is truth in it, and we'll say that I'm with the descendants of the person who wrote the Blade and Races. Okay.
And one of these days I'll challenge the Ridleys to a poetry competition. They can send their best poet, and we'll see if
I'm sure you'll win.
See if Honour's satisfied.
Okay, thanks. Now, tell us a bit about your own background.
My mum, still alive. She should be 90 in June. I'm going crazy. She'll be 100 in June.
100.
Yeah. And she was brought up in Gateshead in terrible poverty in the 1920s, 1930s. Great sense of humour. She's had a very hard life, but I remember she was telling me on one occasion the family shared one egg between them. I mean, it sounds like something out of Monty Python, but it's true. I mean, they were terrible poverty. But anyway, she married my dad when he came home on leave from the army, and for a honeymoon went to India, and she thought she was in heaven. She food as much as you wanted, and
well, it would be a lot more exotic than Gateshead, wouldn't it?
Exotic, and servants and all sorts. She just thought she was in heaven. Loved it. Came back after the war, and went back to poverty again, and my mum and dad gradually built their lives up after the war. So I think I think my favourite song to sum up that era of the 20s and the 30s and the Depression has to be Bing Crosby, and I've got a lovely version of him singing "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" It really brings that out, I think, that whole era.
Now, that was your mother you told us about, Nigel. What about your dad?
Well, my dad left school when he was 14. As soon as he was old enough, went down the pit. He was a miner, but left the pit where after a few years joined the army, and the army gave him a life, gave him a family. His mum had died when he was very young, and the army was like family for him.
Yes.
It was home for him. And I'm not a big one for wars and armies and so on, but I'm very proud of my dad. So it makes me, I have this sort of mixed feeling about the army. I'm proud of my dad, but I don't like wars. So it's this weird contradictory feeling you have. So anyway, and he travelled all over and spent a long time in India. That's, as I was saying, where him and my mum lived for donkey's years. He was a great athlete. He was a boxer. Never a violent man. Very strong, very powerful, but very gentle man. And anyway, so I think to conjure up that image of India, a beautiful song from the film Monsoon Wedding. It's by one of India's most popular singers, Mohammed Rafi. We'll maybe play that.
Okay, let's hear Monsoon Wedding by Mohammed Rafi. Okay, thanks for that, Nigel. Now, you were talking about the war, and I know that more recently you've written poems about the war, but what about poems, other people's poems about the war? What would you choose?
There's a particular verse from Lawrence Binion's poem which they play on Armistice, which is always used on Armistice Day, and it's a perfect example of simple words having a very powerful impact on the listener.
Okay,
So
these are the words, listeners. They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. That's from For the Fallen by Lawrence Binion.
Okay, and what I like about that is just it's just a beautifully chosen, very simple words like
It
at
is.
the going down of the sun. It just conjures up a whole raft of images, which if you just said at sunset, it wouldn't work. Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes. Well, of course, it does evoke kind of the end of life, doesn't it, as well?
And the going down at the ground. It's very moving, very powerful.
Okay, and I think you've got another poem.
Well, I wanted to capture a little bit about war's very much a man's game, and I wanted to capture the woman's side of this, and also this kind of contradiction between you love the soldier, but there's this terrible job they have to do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here we go. It's Sergeant Bill. Where are you lying now, my Sergeant Bill? They sent me back your letters, Sergeant Bill. Sent me caps and sent a kit bag. Sent me boxes and an old flag, but no one thought to send me Sergeant Bill. Shipped you off like cargo, Sergeant Bill. Stamped and documented, Sergeant Bill. Gave you boots and gave you blanco, an old rifle and some ammo, but no quartermaster gave me Sergeant Bill. Where are you lying now, my Sergeant Bill? Telegrams forgot to say, my Sergeant Bill. Said how proud they were and grateful. Great deeds you did, but fatal. But paper's not the same as Sergeant Bill. I suppose you did your duty, Sergeant Bill. Still, I'd rather have a coward, Sergeant Bill, to hold me and to need me, to love me and to feed me, through all the years you leave me, Sergeant Bill.
Thanks for that, Nigel. Right, now on to yourself. Can you tell us a bit about your early years, school time?
Yeah, I went to a fantastic school, George Stevenson. He keeps appearing in my life. My great-great-grandfather knew him. I mean,
Is this the George Stevenson?
The George Stevenson, yeah.
The
And,
George
and the
Stevenson.
school's named after him, and we used to play near his cottage.
Did you play railways?
No, we just pulled birds' nests out of trees, and we were evil little boys. But there we are. And it was a fantastic school. It was a grammar school, and I'm so pleased about the comprehensive school, because so much talent is wasted. I mean, we were very privileged going to grammar school, and while I was there, I really enjoyed my time. I was particularly interested in science. I just loved the world of science. But I also had this kind of contradictory love of creative writing. Slight problem was I had a very bad stammer at the time, and my handwriting was also very bad. So I couldn't get across what I was trying to say
Right.
in my creative writing. I mean, normal subjects you can just make out what the writing is supposed to be. But my English teacher was very supportive. Interesting, my head teacher later on, not long before he died, he explained his feelings. He'd gone into the army as an officer, and he was just so impressed at the potential of the people who he was working with. People have been on the dole for years and years and years, and sort of written off. And all of a sudden, when the country needs them, you need 10,000 pilots. You train up 10,000 pilots. You need 10,000 radio operators. You train them up. And there's the potential there. And what he said was, he was so angry that it took a war to bring that out in people. So he wanted to become a teacher, so he could bring it out, the potential, without having to go through all that terrible business of war.
Okay, so we've got a budding artist, Nigel, a budding artist and a budding scientist having
Maybe.
some difficulties at school. What kind of music would you say summed up that period for you?
Well, a couple of songs really. And my first one I remember was walking up to school singing an Elvis number. I mean, me and my partner now, we still sit in the pub, and if Elvis comes in, we both start crying. Why did you leave us? Well, this is
Do you dress up as Elvis?
No, it's not that bad. Nothing that bad. But Teddy Bear.
Teddy Bear.
The Elvis song. It's not his best. It's just the one I sang.
No, I don't know that
Walking
song.
up this-
I'll look forwards. Let's hear Teddy Bear by Elvis Presley. Great stuff. And what was the other song you mentioned, Nigel?
Well, there's so much music I'd love to play, and there isn't time. But I suppose the biggest early influence, apart from people like Elvis and Buddy Holly, rhythm and blues, and the blues generally, and it's got to be the Animals.
After school, Nigel, you went on to university. What was the university time like for you?
Well, school was great, and at the time we lived in what was the largest council estate in Europe. I understand, was Longbenton estate, and very few of us went on to university then. It was such a shame. I mean, there's so much more opportunity for children now. But I went to Hull to do science, because I just found science so, I don't know, just so such a wonderful subject. I was doing physics.
Now, the only thing I know about Hull University is that the poet Philip Larkin worked there. Did you have anything to do with him? Did he teach you poetry at all?
No, my one claim to fame is that I used to pay my library fines to Philip Larkin.
Right.
Though strictly, if the truth was told, we never saw him.
Well, let's move swiftly on then to...
Well, I'd like
Yes.
to... just the feel of being a student and being
Okay.
away from home. And I think the song that really sums that up is Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone. It's just opening up horizons. It's an amazing song.
Right, student days are over, education over, it's time for the world of work. Where did you start?
Well, having a bad stammer, which was sort of going away a little bit by then, I probably chose the wrong job, went to be a teacher, but strangely, I never stammered in the classroom. Most odd. But I got very interested in children with special needs, and we'll talk about that in a moment or two, about where I went to
Yes.
next. But I'd like to just sum up the feeling from school, the very positive approach that children can bring to things. And I got What a Wonderful World. Sam Cooke just sums up to me the hope and the positive outlook.
Okay, and then if you were to choose a poem, Nigel, that's in some way sums up that time, what would it be?
Well, I mentioned children with special needs, and this is based on one lad I taught. I've changed the name, obviously. It's based very loosely on a very slow skipping rhyme, the rhythm of the poem, and it's called Kevin Finney. Little Kevin Finney was pale, weak and skinny. Little skinny Finney, as the kids called him. Running Kevin Finney, glasses held on grimly, panicky and screamy as the kids chased him. Crying Kevin Finney, sobbed on his mother's pinny. You gotta tell me, mammy, why the kids hate me. Listen, Kevin Hinney, don't be such a whingy, frightened little baby, as his dad told him. Trying Kevin Finney, was beaten in the spinney, crouching in the alley as the kids left him. Growing Kevin Finney, left his school so quickly, never been so happy when the kids lost him. Apprentice Kevin Finney, they blacked his balls with cherry, shoved him down the lavvy on his first day in. Working Kevin Finney, made a job so tinny, thicky tinny Finney as his mates called him. Called up Kevin Finney, put him in the army, put him in the barracks with soldiers baiting him. They tormented Kevin Finney for months and showed no pity. You'll have to learn to take it, as they all told him. Hanging Kevin Finney, took his life on Sunday, left no note to ask them why they hated him. Buried Kevin Finney, forgot him very quickly, brought it all upon himself, they all said of him.
Okay, so that was life as a teacher. What came next?
Well, I retrained as a psychologist and started working as an educational psychologist in the region, and became very interested in working with families with children with particular difficulties, often behaviour problems, which are extremely difficult for parents to deal with. And that's what I specialised in, and I wrote a couple of books about that, and I've been training teachers and psychologists in this work for quite some time now, and it can get very serious, so I thought I'd just lighten things up a little bit with a great song that sums up the the craziness of the children, not craziness in an unpleasant way,
The sheer,
the sheer energy and
chaos.
anarchy that the parents have to deal with. So I've got Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire, and one of these days, I'm learning piano now, and one of these days I'd love to play piano like Jerry Lee, but I don't think I ever will.
I look forward to that, and when you get up to that standard, Nigel, we'll have you back on the programme and play it for us, okay?
That'll be a long time.
Okay, so you're a trained psychologist. What came next?
Well, it was in parallel, really. Psychology training, it's quite a broad area, but you don't always get the experiences that you wanted. And one of the areas which I developed an interest in, which wasn't really covered much on the course, was counselling. And I became very interested in counselling, just, partly as a personal thing for myself, but also found it a very powerful way to work with people, dealing with issues that they found very hard to deal with, things like bereavement and so on. And possibly got a poem here which brings out some of the feelings that we get buried in when we're dealing with bereavement, which are very, very hard to bring out.
Okay, well, just before you read that poem, were you actually writing poetry at that time?
Oh, I've been kind of writing ever since I was at school, really, but I probably started writing more then, and eventually got this collection together for the Inquiry, which made a nice little book.
Okay,
but
well,
the man who knew the book, the man who knew the make, it's got images from the age of steam.
yes.
It's like an old steam engine
Yes.
starting up, and anyway, I'll
Let's hear it.
Okay. The man who knew the make. I cannot see, I do not understand why this body no longer lives. I cannot remember. Yes, clearer now. I do remember. I remember the day the mill broke down. I remember the feel of the air, the very colour of the light that day the engine died. Ever with us in our workplace made the ground beneath us thrill, no matter where or what the season, that engine bound us to its will. But then, that day, at first a falter, then a most peculiar cry, the engine shifted in its halter, the engine slowed, began to die. A vital vein in vital clockwork pulsed an oily wasteful stream. A gear seized and pistons welded, crying out with vented steam. The wheel lurched, once spun, jammed, then settled, while boilers cooled and metal ticked. But then they called up first the foreman, then the man who knew the make, then the craftsman, then the guildsman. Then the room grew thick with skill. Soon that wheezing, dying engine lived and turned and shook at will. Now show me, please, oh please, I beg you, show me how and where to mend. Fix this corpse, this solid waxwork. Restore to life my loving friend. Bring me up no mumbling doctor, with yes and no and just perhaps. Send away that bloody surgeon with cut and probe and gouge and hack. I want right fast that engineering, oily-handed lord of life, that overalled, certificated, metal master lord of life. Drag him from his dusty cavern, drag him from that coaly slake, find him, pay him, sign and bind him, find the man who knows the make. What I get angry about sometimes is the waste of talent when there's such unemployment. And there's great potential and great talent around in the region. I'll just give an example. I mean, I had two lovely sisters. One died, and there's my brother who he started life as a colliery engineer, electrical engineer down the pit.
Down the pits like your dad used to.
Yeah. Actually, he left the pit and went to South Africa and went down a gold mine and couldn't believe that you could smoke down a pit. Anyway, you have to be incredibly resourceful if you're a mile down and a mile away from the shaft bottom. You can't go crying for help when something goes wrong. You've got to fix it. And he's just fantastically talented. He can, if you've got a rusty nut that a spanner won't shift, you can use a chisel as a spanner. It's a work of art to. I mean, if I did that, I'd just snap the nut off. You can turn the nut with a chisel, and he just laughs at me. You know, he says I've got more degrees than a thermometer, and I can't change a spark plug. Anyway,
you don't need to with a brother like that, though, do you?
There's wonderful talent in the region. And we'll talk a bit about that later, maybe.
Okay, well, let's move on to your career. I believe you became a pop star for a short period. Is this right?
That's exaggerating things rather a lot.
Really?
well,
well,
when I was 40. My lovely partner asked me what I wanted for my 40th birthday, and I said, "Well, there's nothing really, because I'm not really into stuff. I didn't really want very much." And she kept asking. I said, "Well, look, there's nothing I want." She said, "Well, there must have been something when you were a kid that you wanted that you never got." I said, "Well, all right. Well, the only thing I could think of was I wanted a drum kit. And I never got one." So she went out and bought one. And when you have a drum kit, you can't just play it on your own. You feel a fool, so you need to create a bit of a band. So we started this little band off. And once you say you're starting a band, all your mates come out of the woodwork and they all want to join. And we ended up with a 9-piece band. And we played rock and roll. And we called ourselves Johnny and the Retreads. And we weren't very good. In fact, we were pretty hopeless most of the time. But we found one secret was, it doesn't matter how bad you are playing, as long as you don't actually physically stop. As long as the music carries on, the audience, particularly when they're tanked up, will dance. And particularly to something like the Rolling Stones. And we did a very bad version of Jumpin' Jack Flash, which has to be one of the Stones' dirtiest records. I don't mean dirty in that sense, I mean dirty sounding. It's such a brilliant record.
Okay, listeners, well, Nigel's not exaggerating when he's talking about Johnny and the Retreads. You can hear them on YouTube, and there's a long way to go before they match the Stones singing Jumping Jack Flash. Okay, well, that's your career as a possibly might have been pop star, Nigel. What did you do next?
Well, getting on a bit now, the children, got two lovely children. The nice thing about them isn't their achievements and so on, it's the fact that they're so very loving and got a great sense of humour. I think that's so important. Anyway, they'd grown up a bit, so that gave us a bit of space, and I was able to do something which I'd been toying with for ages, which I started some research, and that's a most peculiar thing to do, doing research for a PhD, and particularly the area I was in, which is even more peculiar, which is researching how you go about doing research.
So researching research itself.
yeah, and you're looking at yourself doing your research and trying to figure out what you're doing as you're figuring out how to do it. It's a bit like chewing your own teeth
It sounds like trying to mend a car as you're racing along.
without knowing where to start. So I was doing that for a long time, and it got into very complicated areas about where does knowledge come from, what constitutes data, what's a theory, how do you establish that. So it got into some very peculiar areas, and then when I came to write it up, what I was determined to do was to write, even though it was very complicated and confusing, was to write it as simply and clearly as I could, which is one thing I've always tried to do in my poetry and all my other writing, is to try to use as simple words to get across complicated theories and ideas and so on. So I think I came across very recently a lovely version of the old Shaker hymn, Simple Gifts. It's sung by Alison Krauss, and although I don't go a big deal on the religious aspects of it, just the message about how simple things are so important comes across.
You've been a student and you've worked for a number of years, I don't know, 15 or 20 years maybe, as teacher, counsellor and educational psychologist, taking a PhD on the subject of research. Now, I know you've written one or two books, including one on attention-seeking behaviour. What's that all about?
Part of the problem with the whole topic of attention seeking is that it's very hard to even recognise it. Because when children get into an attention seeking pattern, anything, any form of behaviour can be used to get attention. Anything from picking your nose to scraping your chair to not eating your tea to screaming to crawling about the floor, barking like a dog. Anything, and parents don't know what's hit them. They can't understand. They can't see the common thread that's going through all these very peculiar behaviours, and it's a kind of topsy-turvy world where things work the opposite way around to what you'd expect. And the first point is that it's the very best parents who are most vulnerable to this kind of behaviour. If you didn't give a...
So you mean it's the best parents that have the most trouble?
Right. If you didn't give a damn, you wouldn't bother.
Yeah.
You let the child swing on the chandeliers, peeing in the corner, picking his nose, whatever. It's because you're concerned as a parent, because you want to do your best for your children, because you want to help them and change these peculiar behaviours, that you then become vulnerable. They've got you in their power in a strange way. That's not to say the children are evil. They don't sit and plan it. It's something
they sort of
manipulate.
They can manipulate their parents through seeking attention.
Manipulate's the wrong word. It's a pattern that they gradually fall into. And the parents, because they're so close to it and so concerned and trying so hard, don't see how they get trapped into it themselves. I've got great sympathy for parents. It's extremely difficult to deal with. And one of the advantages of being a professional is you can stand outside and see what's going on and help parents to understand. And another one of the strange contradictory things about it is most kids, if they misbehave, you punish them, they stop. I mean, being a bit old-fashioned here, using words like punishment, but you know what I mean. If you give them a punishment, by and large, they'll stop doing it. With children who are demanding attention and who are taking it to great extremes, you punish them, and they do it all the more. And parents don't know what's going on. They can't understand. Nothing seems to work, and they get so frustrated. And so we have to spend a long time explaining and showing what needs to be done so that parents understand it and can go through and deal with a very distressing problem. There's a little video on my website, which I did a recording with Tyne-Tees Television a few years ago. So if you go to nmellor.com, there's a video and explains a lot more about it.
Right, thanks very much for that, Nigel. Now, I also believe you're currently working on another book on something completely different. Or
Maybe,
is it?
maybe getting old, I don't know. It's turning to different matters. The last 10 or 12 years I've been very interested in Buddhism. And I think there's a core there which is so important and explains so much, but it's very difficult to get to. It often gets hidden between complicated language and Buddhist religious traditions, so it's sometimes difficult to get to the core.
Do you mean this the sort of language about there being 7 jewels of experience and that kind of thing?
Well, there's a lot of technical language, and people who study Buddhism have to learn this technical language, and people coming from the outside get mystified by it. Mm-hmm. Words like emptiness, which has a very common everyday meaning,
yes,
but has a very specialised meaning in Buddhism. So what I've tried to do anyway is I've written this book called Buddha Light. There's a little bit of a joke there, and it's Buddhism stripped back. It's trying to get to the essence of it without using any peculiar words or strange terms or any images from the mystic East of tigers and lotus flowers and things, which are very beautiful and come into the Buddhist literature, but aren't much help if you live in Wigan. And anyway, part of the essence of Buddhism, in fact, probably the essence, is the idea of compassion. There's other stuff like peace of mind and so on, but compassion's so important. And I've got a piece of music here which I think just sums up the beauty of and the power of compassion. And it's not Buddhist. It's a piece from The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart. It's the same opera that, if you remember, the Shawshank Redemption, there's a beautiful piece in there. Well, that's from earlier in the opera. This is the last aria, really, and the opera's silly. It's a stupid little tale, but Mozart can write the most beautiful music, particularly for women's voices. So this is one where, right at the end, after all the shenanigans, the count's asking for forgiveness.
Thanks for that choice, Nigel. Contessa Pedoni from Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. Now, you've done a lot of different things that you've told us about, Nigel. Most people will think of you as a writer and a poet, particularly the booklet that you brought out a year or two ago for the Inquiry. Can you tell us something about your approach to poetry, why you write it, how you write it? What's it all about for you?
It's hard to say, really, but I think the best poetry really has an emotional kick. That's what it does. It's kind of concentrated emotion. And my own feeling is that when we're writing poetry, there's a bit of a temptation to use fancy words like iridescent and so on, and they have a role. But for me, I think what the heart of poetry, the real essence of it, is when you can use the simplest words to have the most powerful emotional impact.
So this is a sort of simplicity that you've talked before about it, and maybe is also the simplicity of Buddhism, do you think, that's influencing you?
Well, there's a very simple, powerful story in Buddhism, if you can get through all the strangeness,
all the iridescence,
all the strangeness of it all. So here's one. I just try to express a poem about poetry.
right?
And it's called The Craft of the Poet, and it's my idea about using the simplest words to have the most impact. So, the craft of the poet. The craft of the poet is not to set jewels into the walls of a hut, but to take old stone and build a cathedral.
Okay, well, sticking with that collection, Nigel, do you want to choose one or two poems from it to read to us?
Okay, so this one's called Spelem on a Sunday. Spelem Harbour sits in pools of engine oil, not leaking thick from a tanker, but thin and wasted, furtively disposed. A beach of stones and half bricks, round but not quite smooth enough to hide the brickwork's stamp. Leading to this sorry tip were many paths, but mining falls and erosion by the weather and neglect had cut them jagged. Harbour to unwary folk is promise of a welcome scene, but in Spelem's worked out maze of walls within walls, the coal-stained sea sucks up beaches oblong, flat, and squirts through concrete cracks. Further down, an abandoned mineral line, and staring out, someone remembered Spelem, full of men.
Thanks very much for that, Nigel. And now I'd like us to hear one of your other poems in the collection called Suit of Fell.
Very sadly, one of the highest rates of suicide in all the professions is amongst farmers. And although we don't think of this as a farming region, there's a big farming area around us. And I was trying to capture a scene I saw of one night driving back, just as it was growing at dusk, a farmer in this very lonely farmhouse out on the fells. So here we go. On Souter Fell. Latches rasp on rough plank door, opening to the sad half-light of Souter Fell. Through draughty kitchen to sodden heath, past rusting spares of farm machines, he trudged unmarked, returned ungreeted, with logs to burn, with thoughts to speak. This bloody fell, this mean poor pasture, unfit for men, not fit for beasts, stones it grows, they spring up daily, grass it yields, a miser's treats. He drove his thoughts like simple creatures and turned them to a well-trod path, perhaps a woman warm and tender, with odd-off days and secret ways, with things to dust and rinds to render, but not some farmer's coarse-grained maid, a voice to still the killing silence, perhaps another tale to tell, and place of days all worn out, hopeless, soaked up there on Souter Fell. Okay, well, we started with something from the region with the Bladen races, and I've talked about my feeling about the great potential amongst the people of the region. I mean, sometimes you have to leave to get a job, but there's great people like Ridley Scott, the director of Alien and Blade Runner, the chap who thought up the God particle, Peter Higgs. He's from Wallsend.
Know that.
Catherine Cookson was one of the best read authors in the whole of the country. She's from South Shields. Our two universities are at the cutting edge of development in things like stem cell research, wind turbines, photovoltaics. That's the electricity panels on your roof.
This is the scientist in you coming out now, isn't
Obviously,
it?
yes. And then my partner, she's part of an international research group who are working on a good economic solution to the financial crisis we're in, and that's cutting edge economics. So, and we've got things like Nissan, the most successful car factory we've ever had. Not that I'm into cars, but if it's needed, we can do it here. We've got the people, we've got the place, and I want to end with a sort of looking forward to just reminding ourselves of the beauty of the region. We've talked about the potential of the people here, but the region itself, just living here is fantastic. So an old song which takes us forward, just reminding us what a privilege it is to be in this area. The Waters of Tyne, and the singers Isla Cameron.